And this is a big risk because we, that is our global human society, and also our natural environment are much more vulnerable than many people realize. I'll give you a few examples of our instability. I don't know if you know this photograph, but it shows the stock market in New York in 1921. I took the year and put it on the top left. This was a huge crash which caused the Great Depression. Perhaps it didn't just cause it, but at least it was a strong element in it. Let me show what happened. Here you have a graph in which the vertical axis shows the level of a crisis. And now here is the first part of the graph. And as you can see, this part ends with the Great Depression that started in 1929. The high peaks are really very strong crashes. And as this image shows, the Great Depression was not the first crash, not by far. For instance, there was, not many years before, the hyperinflation after World War I, showing, for instance, the infamous billion-dollar marks. As you can see, miljarden in German stands for billions in English. So it's really a lot, but not actually. Even before that, there was the Panic of 1907, and as you can see, in the century before, there were also a few big crashes. Now let's look after 1929. This is what we got afterwards. First, you can see here the debt crisis after World War II. Then there is the oil shock inflation in the 70s. And much more recently, we had the big crash from 2008 and after, which has been called the Great Recession. Most of you will remember it vividly, I suppose. Here's another example of how economics is destroying our world, or at least threatening it. I showed you already that climate change is causing huge wildfires in many continents. But there's also a less literal, more figurative way in which this is true. Let me show you this graph of the Earth Overshoot Day, which shows us in which rate we are destroying our planet by exhaustion and overconsumption. And this graph compares the ecological footprint with the biocapacity of our planet. And ideally, we take care that the ecological footprint never exceeds the biocapacity of our planet. But that is unfortunately not the case. First, to get the idea, look at the first part of the graph, which is here. Here you can see that we use more of our planet than our planet is able to deliver, which means that in those years, around 1970, it was such that the ecological footprint was a bit higher than the biocapacity, and so our ecological budget was used around 1 month too early. The entire biocapacity of our planet for a whole year was consumed in 11 months. But it didn't stay that way, as you can see now. This is the actual situation, and this means that already at the end of July, we have used our budget for a whole year. Now, as you can see, the year 2020 was an exception, and you can probably guess the cause of that. That was the pandemic collapse of the economy, in which everybody was hopeful that perhaps this was the way to learn our lesson. And so perhaps this was a trend break where we could learn to use less of our planet. But unfortunately, this appeared to be not true, because the year 21 was in fact continuing the trend of the years before. And as I said, we are much more vulnerable than many people realize, which is strikingly illustrated by this photograph, which was really actually taken from the planet Mars. What you can see here is on the left, a bit to the left, planet Earth, and also a bit to the right and higher up is the Moon. And this is an image that strikes me as showing, illustrating our vulnerability, which can be seen also in another way, because here you have our planet in a very different way. And this is not only illustrating where humans live, but symbolically it also illustrates how our economic system came into being, which was not planned. Some people may perhaps think that our current economic system was thought out in a very clever way. It was designed, but actually it was not designed. It rather grew spontaneously to what it is now, and in this way it may be compared with a petri dish in which you have a lot of fungi and etc., which also show a spontaneous pattern. And this is actually what our economic system is like. It came into being through coincidence. Here is one consequence of the fact that the economic system was not really designed, but just grew spontaneously. One of the consequences is the fact that, as you can see, money attracts money, which is shown symbolically in this and the next images. Money attracts money, which means that it takes money to invest in order to gather money from your surroundings. And it has been shown, for instance, by Piketty a few years ago, that it is a much more efficient way when you have money to invest it than simply to work. Work is not a very efficient way to create or to gather money. Now, this is shown in this image where you find all those tiny yellow dots, which symbolically represent money. And you can imagine that they are gold coins, or you can imagine that they are bank accounts, or whatever you think. Anyway, if this is an initial situation in which money is theoretically distributed quite well around the world and around all people, then due to the fact that money attracts to each other like a kind of gravity, then sometime later it will spontaneously evolve into a situation like this, in which you can see that money is clustering. And if this goes on for a while, then it will proceed in that direction, and perhaps sometime later even here, in which you can see on the one hand huge clusters of money that may symbolically represent either multinational corporations or perhaps super rich individuals, billionaires. And in other places you see those empty spaces which symbolizes the people who don't have anything or hardly anything. By the way, these images are not only to be found in the book, but they are also elements of a video that you can find on YouTube, and on the web page of the book you can find the link to it. If this goes on, then there is a big risk that in the end this lack of solidarity between people will result in a growing dissatisfaction and finally perhaps a violent revolution, like the French Revolution or the Russian one, in which case everything explodes, which doesn't really help, because not only there's a lot of violence and death, but also it will result in exactly the same situation, since the basic structure has not been changed. Still, money attracts money. This eventually you will again find a situation in which money clusters, only this time in different places. And so you may wonder, okay, but listen, we may be vulnerable, and you talk about a lot of threats and possible disasters and everything. And yes, I do, but perhaps you will say, as some other people usually tell me, that I shouldn't worry that much because it's going to be all right. In the end, eventually, it's always ended well. Right? Well, that's an interesting hypothesis that can be tested. And so I went to the test by looking first at the oldest, really ancient culture in our planet, which was the Sumerian culture, as you can see here, with its numbers. Interesting question is, what does this culture look like right now? So I found a striking photograph of the current situation in this Sumerian culture, which is to be found in Mesopotamia, the land of the two rivers in the Middle East. Well, this area now looks like this. So you can see this culture did not end well. Let's have a look at some others. Here are a few more. And I should say here that you shouldn't take all those years too literal, because, well, if you consult different sources, you will end up with different numbers. But anyway, this gives you a good idea of when, roughly speaking, those cultures existed. You can also doubt whether it's correct to describe the Chinese empires as one long series of cultures. Perhaps you should separate them, but that's in the details. It doesn't really matter. So let me go on and show you a few more recent cultures and empires. This is a list, probably an incomplete list, but it at least gives you some idea. Between 1000 before till 1000 after Christ. And of course, we still need a third list, which is here, in which you can find cultures and empires on many continents. For instance, Great Zimbabwe was in Africa, and the Aztec Empire, well known, was in America, etc. And if you look at this list, we're still missing one. And that's our current culture. Well, you can give a name to it. I took as a name the Information Age, but you could also speak of the Industrial Age, in which case I should take another starting year, probably somewhere around 1800 or whatever. But this is just to give you an idea. So take it all, don't take it all too literal. Well, in this long list of cultures and mighty, powerful empires, I will show you which of them ended well. At least, well, we're not yet ended, but the others did. So perhaps it's not really true that it always ended well. Actually, it's quite the opposite. It never ended well. It's a main characteristic of empires and cultures that they arrive, they grow, they prosper, and then they end. Not well. This is not the exception. This is the norm. But some people then say to me, this time it's different. Yeah, well, they are right. This time, yes, it is different. For several reasons. One reason is we're still here. and that's true. Second reason, we know a lot more than all previous cultures and empires and mighty powers. Yes, we know a lot more, and hence we also can do a lot more. We can do a lot more destroying, but we can also do a lot more repairing. So the latter is good news. And then we are, and this is really new, this is innovative, we are worldwide, which means we are the only culture. And perhaps if you see that, you may protest and say, hey, listen, for instance, take China. That's very different from the Western world in Europe and North America, isn't it? No, it isn't. Not actually, because if you look at it, well, the internet, for instance, is global. Other things, the financial system is global. When the markets crash in Japan, in Tokyo, then it will only take a couple of hours before they also do that the same in Amsterdam and in London and in New York. It's all connected. When we go down, everything goes down globally. In other words, there are no reserve cultures anymore, no spare cultures that may survive if other cultures collapse. In other words, if our present culture collapses, it will be the final demise. Everything will go down. And perhaps this needs a little bit more explanation, because, okay, you can imagine, right, okay, it might happen and it would be terrible, but perhaps in 100 or 1,000 years, perhaps even in 10,000 years, some humans will get up and start some new culture and new technology and new everything, literature and culture and you name it. But that's not true. Because everything that you need in order to climb upwards towards the kind of culture that we have nowadays, well, it will take the metals from the ground and the oil and gas, the fossil fuels for a while in order to build technology and everything. But nowadays we are taking everything. So a next possible humanity, or even in 100 million years, a next species, will not be able to do what we are doing right now. Which means, indeed, if our culture collapses due to climate change, due to a series of economic collapses or whatever, it will be the last culture on this planet until the sun dies. How vulnerable actually are we? What are the kinds of threats that exist? Well, there are many. Actually, it is as if our planet Earth is on the top of a steep mountain with only a small hole at the top, which offers us some kind of resemblance to stability. And there are all kinds of possible tipping points where we can go down, distributed over all of the 3 P's of the triple P: planet, people, and profit. I just give you 2 examples of each. When you go to my book, you will see even more. For people, you can think of refugees and war. You can think, for instance, of hundreds of millions of refugees due to climate change, which will destroy the prospering countries. But you can also think of strife-torn society within countries. If solidarity is going down, the revolution is threatening, destroying everything. On the planet side, well, I already mentioned the climate change and the 6th extinction. And on the profit side, there's the never-ending growth, while we know we cannot grow indefinitely, but still the economic system seems to need growth every year again and again, and also the crashing markets. These are only six possible causes of instability that may suddenly strike through tipping points. And now you can imagine what people are trying to do, economists and the powerful people in the world. What are they trying to do to improve this? Well, actually, what they mainly do is offer laws and regulations to stop it. But can you really imagine that if something really starts to go down, that it will be impressed by our laws and regulations and that those will stop it? It simply doesn't. This is unthinkable. So we need a very much more severe approach. We need to go to the fundaments, to the structures of our economic system. We need to redesign, this time actually designing the economic system. That's what we need. What we need is this, a much larger kind of stability. Compare this to the former image and you can see what I mean. And symbolically, I express this as the broad holloway. So the goal of economics and of science should be to design such a broad holloway. That's the task.